In the spring of 1851, somewhere in the fertile Black Belt region of central Alabama, a woman named Catherine Hartley stepped quietly into her husband's study at 3 o'clock in the morning and found a scene that would destroy 3 lives forever. What she witnessed that night, later revealed only through a series of sealed letters kept by the Mobile Historical Society until 1924, led one of the most disturbing acts of revenge ever whispered about in Antebellum Southern society. Within 48 hours, 2 people bound by law and custom to Catherine's will simply vanish from Hartley Plantation. No questions were asked, no authorities were called, and for nearly 70 years, the truth of what Catherine Hartley did to her husband and the enslaved man she found him would remain buried beneath the polished surface of Southern respectability. Before we continue the story of the Hartley family and the night that shattered their carefully constructed world, if you're listening from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, drop a comment telling us where you're from. And if stories like this, real human darkness hidden behind history's closed doors, intrigue you, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, shame, and vengeance in the Old South. The truth is, what happened at Hartley Plantation wasn't supernatural. It wasn't mysterious in the traditional sense. It was something far more chilling, the calculated cruelty that human beings are capable of when their pride is wounded and their power is absolute. Greene County, Alabama, in the early 1850s, was a world unto itself, the Black Belt, named for its dark, fertile soil rather than its population, though both meanings applied, stretched across the heart of the state like a prosperous wound. Cotton was king, and those who controlled the land and the people who worked it lived like royalty of a distinctly American kind. The county seat of Utah was a place of wide streets and narrow mines, where Greek revival mansions stood as gleaming white monuments to wealth built on black labor. Hartley Plantation covered nearly 2,000 acres along the Tombigbee River, its grand house a testament to the family's rise from modest Carolina origins to Alabama aristocracy. Thomas Hartley had purchased the land in 1834, when Alabama was still young and hungry, and over 17 years had transformed it into one of the most productive estates in the region. 240 souls lived and worked on Hartley land, men, women, and children whose names appeared in ledgers as assets rather than as people. Their worth calculated in dollars beside columns of cotton yields and birth rates. The big house itself was a 2-story structure of white painted brick, with 6 massive columns supporting a wraparound gallery that embraced 3 sides of the building. Inside, the rooms were furnished with pieces shipped from New Orleans and draped in fabrics imported from France. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the double parlor. Persian carpets softened the heart pine floors. The library held more than 400 volumes, though no one knew how many Thomas Hartley had actually read. Catherine Wilmington Hartley had come to the plantation as a bride in 1842, a 19-year-old daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant who had fallen on hard times. The marriage, like most in their circle, had been arranged for mutual advantage. Thomas needed a wife who could manage a grand household and bear heirs. Catherine needed stability and status. Love, if it was ever considered at all, was expected to bloom later, a pleasant side effect of proximity and shared purpose. For 9 years, Catherine had fulfilled her role with the precision expected of a woman of her station. She oversaw 12 house servants, managed the endless social obligations of plantation mistress, and bore Thomas 2 daughters, Margaret in 1843 and Elenina in 1846. She kept meticulous account books, recording every expense from dress fabric to field tools. She planned elaborate dinners that stretched on for 5 hours and 7 courses. She smiled across candlelit tables at her husband and never complained about the profound loneliness of her position. But Catherine Hartley was not the ornamental woman her Charleston schooling had intended her to be. She was intelligent, observant, and though she would never have spoken the word aloud, angry at the limits placed on her sex, angry at her dependence, angry at the way power operated in her world. She learned early how to channel that anger into control. Over the years, she quietly became indispensable to the running of the plantation in ways that went far beyond the typical duties of a mistress. She knew every enslaved person by name, age, and skill. She understood the intricate web of family ties within the quarters. She had taught herself basic medicine and personally tended to the sick, not out of compassion, but because healthy workers were more productive. She knew which overseers were competent and which were simply cruel. She knew the cotton market as well as any broker in Mobile, and she knew things about her husband that he believed she did not. Thomas Hartley, at 43, considered himself a success. He had wealth, influence, a fine house, and the respect of his peers. He sat on the county board of commissioners. He served as a deacon at Mesopotamia Baptist Church. His opinions on agriculture and trade were valued and sought after. He wore authority like a second skin, easy, comfortable, unquestioned. But Thomas Hartley harbored a secret that could have destroyed him if it were ever revealed. Not the sort of secret men of his class often kept. A mistress in town, a gambling debt, a land dispute. No, this was something far more dangerous. Something that, in Alabama in 1851, carried consequences ranging from social death to imprisonment under the state sodomy laws. For more than 3 years, Thomas had been involved in a relationship with a man named Jacob, an enslaved man who had lived on the Hartley property since childhood. Jacob was 28 years old in the spring of 1851, a skilled carpenter responsible for maintaining the plantation's many buildings and tools. He was literate, secretly taught to read by his mother, who had herself learned from the daughter of her previous owner in Virginia. He possessed a quiet intelligence that Thomas had noticed when Jacob was barely 20. How it began is something history would never fully answer. Perhaps Thomas had sought him out, using his power to take what he desired. Or perhaps there had been a fleeting moment of mutual recognition. Two men trapped, in different ways, by the same unyielding system, finding in each other something the world around them said could not exist. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, complicated by the simple, brutal fact that consent cannot exist when one man owns the other. Certain was that by 1851, they met regularly in Thomas's study, a ground floor room at the back of the house that opened onto the garden through French doors. Thomas had given Jacob an unusual freedom of movement for an enslaved man, ostensibly so he could check and repair things around the property at any hour. The other enslaved people suspected something, of course. In the cramped intimacy of plantation life, such things could not be kept entirely hidden, but they said nothing. What choice did they have? Catherine had suspected for nearly a year. Not the full truth, perhaps, but enough. The way Thomas looked at Jacob sometimes, the frequency with which he found reasons to have the man near the house, the gifts, a finer coat, a good knife, privileges that seemed excessive even for a valued, skilled worker. But suspicion is not certainty, and Catherine was a woman who dealt in facts. On the night of May 6, 1851, those facts arrived. Catherine had gone to bed at 10 o'clock, as was her custom. Thomas stayed behind in his study, claiming paperwork that required his attention. Also ordinary, he often worked late, especially in planting or harvest seasons. She read for an hour by lamplight, extinguished the flame, and settled into sleep with the complacency of someone whose conscience, if not spotless, at least rested on the assumption of her own rectitude. She woke at 3 a.m. to use the chamber pot and immediately noticed that Thomas's side of bed had not been slept in. Again, not unprecedented. He sometimes dozed at his desk or fell asleep in the study if he'd been drinking. Yet something made Catherine rise, pull a wrapper over her nightgown, and move silently down the hallway toward the stairs. The house at that hour was a study in contrasts. Moonlight pouring through tall windows in rectangles of bluish white. The tall case clock in the entry hall marking the hours with mechanical indifference. The lingering smell of wood ash from the day's fires. Catherine moved without shoes, her bare feet soundless on the polished boards. As she descended, she heard a sound her mind at first refused to interpret correctly. Low male voices in the study, intimate in tone rather than casual, and then a gasp of pleasure so unmistakable its meaning could not be denied. She froze on the bottom step for perhaps 30 seconds, her hand clamped on the newel post until her knuckles whitened. Later, trying to reconstruct that moment, she would remember thinking with terrible clarity, I can turn around. I can go back upstairs. I can never know for certain. But Catherine could not live with uncertainty, not when the truth lay only 20 feet away behind a closed door. She crossed the entry hall and put her hand on the brass knob of the study. It turned silently. Thomas kept hinges and locks well oiled, a habit from his father. She eased the door open perhaps 6 inches, enough to see inside. The lamp on Thomas's desk burned low, casting a warm, golden glow that made the scene look almost like a painting, classical and, in its composition, strangely beautiful. Thomas sat in his leather chair, head tilted back, eyes closed. Jacob knelt before him, his dark skin catching the lamplight, his hands on Thomas's knees. What they were doing was unmistakable, clear, undeniable, incapable of being read as anything else. Catherine watched for maybe 15 seconds. Neither man knew she stood there. Then she closed the door without a sound, returned across the entry hall, climbed the stairs, and walked down the corridor to her room. She bolted her bedroom door, sat on the edge of her bed, and began with methodical calm to plan. The immediate shock passed, and as the night wore on, rage followed. Not a single consuming blaze, but a slow, accumulating fire fed by humiliation and betrayal, and by something darker, a deep sense of violation rooted as much in power as in marriage. Catherine had lived within a rigid hierarchy her whole life. A woman subordinate to men but superior to slaves. A wife bound to her husband but mistress of her household. These rules were sacred, the foundation of her world. What she had seen shattered them. Her husband, who by law and custom held authority over her, had debased himself with a man who by law and custom was property. The transgression was double, against nature as their society defined it, and against the racial order on which their entire way of life depended. If a white man could desire a black man, could place himself in a posture of apparent submission to someone legally enslaved, what then of the natural hierarchy that justified everything? More painfully, Catherine understood with cruel clarity that she had been replaced, not by another woman, which would have been humiliating but comprehensible, but by a man and an enslaved man. Her husband had chosen him over her, risking reputation, position, perhaps even freedom. What did that make her? What did it make their marriage, their children, their entire shared life? By the time gray light began to pale at the windows, Catherine had decided. Her choice was not the product of sudden, blind passion. It was made with the cold calculation that had always been her greatest strength. She would not confront Thomas. She would not cause a scene. She would not seek divorce. Even if scandal could be contained, divorce would leave her penniless and dependent on a father who had nothing to give. She would not expose him to the law or to public disgrace. Instead, she resolved to do something else entirely. Something that would remove the offense from her sight, punish both men in a manner fitting their crime, and be carried out so quietly that no one would ever know the true motive. She would make them disappear, separately but together, in a way that would destroy them while preserving her own position. She knew precisely how to do it. The only question was whether she had the courage or the cruelty to follow through. The institution of slavery in the Antebellum South was built on absolute dominion over other human beings. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, traded, given away, or willed to heirs like any other property. They had no legal recourse, no protection against being torn from family, no voice in their own fate. It was a system Catherine had always accepted as natural and divinely ordained. Now she would use that system to exact her revenge. The morning of May 7th unfolded with complete normalcy. Catherine dressed with her usual precision, oversaw breakfast, and spoke pleasantly to her daughters about their lessons for the day. At 8 o'clock, Thomas appeared at the breakfast table, looking perhaps a bit tired but otherwise ordinary. He kissed his wife on the cheek and casually asked about her plans for the day. If he suspected that she had seen him the night before, He gave no sign. Catherine watched him eat his eggs and ham, sip his coffee, and read to the mobile register, which arrived by mail twice a week. She answered his small talk with her usual calm interest. She poured him a second cup of coffee, and behind that serene, composed face, she was sharpening her plan, weighing every detail, anticipating every obstacle. The key was to act swiftly, before doubt or mercy could interfere. The key was to make it seem like a routine errand. And above all, the key was to ensure that neither man ever had the chance to speak to the other, to align stories, to resist. At 9:30, Catherine excused herself in the morning room and went to find the overseer, a man named Rutledge, who had worked for the Hartleys for 6 years. She found him near the stables, talking with 2 of the field drivers. "Mr. Rutledge," Catherine called, her voice carrying the effortless tone of pleasant authority she had perfected over years of managing a large household. "I need Jacob brought up to the house. There's serious damage to the window frames in the east parlor. I think it may be carpenter ants. I want it checked and repaired before it spreads." Rutledge touched his hat. "Yes, ma'am. I'll send him right up." "Actually," Catherine added lightly, as if the thought had only just occurred to her, "have him come to the back entrance. No need to track to the front rooms if all the work's on the east side." 20 minutes later, Jacob arrived at the back door carrying his toolbox. He was a tall man, lean and strong from years of labor, with intelligent eyes trained to reveal nothing. He'd been born on the Hartley property, the son of a woman named Rachel who worked in the kitchen gardens. His father had been sold away before Jacob was old enough to remember, a story all too common. Jacob had learned carpentry from an older enslaved man named Samuel, now long dead, and had become skilled enough that Thomas relied on him for every kind of repair and improvement. What Jacob felt toward Thomas, what he felt about those encounters in the study, was something buried so deep that perhaps even he could no longer reach it. Survival for him meant accepting certain realities. It meant taking what small advantages came his way. It meant never letting himself fully imagine what freedom would be like, to choose his own path, to love without the shadow of ownership hanging over every thought. Catherine met him at the back door herself, which was unusual. Normally, a housekeeper or one of the servants would handle such errands. "Jacob," she said pleasantly, "there's been a change of plans. I need you to take a message to Mr. Turnbull in Utah. It's about some furniture I ordered. He was supposed to send word when it arrived, but I haven't heard back. I'd like to check on the status." Jacob hesitated for the briefest moment. Delivering messages wasn't part of his usual duties. But questioning the mistress was not an option. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "The wagon's ready for you in the drive." Catherine continued smoothly. "Your tools are already loaded. On your way back, stop at the Dennis farm and assess some work they want done. I told Mrs. Dennis you might be able to fit them in next week." That sounded reasonable enough. Jacob was sometimes hired out other plantations for skilled work, with his wages, of course, going straight to Thomas. He nodded, accepting the explanation. What Jacob didn't know was that the wagon driver wasn't one of the regular Hartley men. He was a stranger, a man named Pierce, hired 3 days earlier from a neighboring plantation, paid extra and given very specific instructions. He didn't know that the letter he carried was sealed and addressed to a man in Utah, an agent for several large slave trading firms in Mobile. And he didn't know that once that wagon left Hartley land, he would never return. Catherine stood watching as the wagon rolled away, Jacob beside Pierce, the morning sun already hot enough to make the dust shimmer along the drive. She felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, no mercy, only the cold satisfaction that the first part of her plan had been carried out flawlessly. Now, for the second, she waited until she saw Thomas heading toward the fields for his usual morning inspection, another routine she could always count on. Then she went back into the house, directly to his study. Locking the door behind her, she crossed his desk and opened a leather-bound ledger where he kept records of every enslaved person on the plantation. She found Jacob's page easily, age 28, carpenter, healthy, valued at $1,200, born on property, mother Rachel, deceased 1847, father, none recorded. Beneath that, in Thomas's neat handwriting, were the words, not to be sold, essential to plantation operations. Catherine took up his pen, dipped it in ink, and with 3 precise strokes, crossed out those words. In their place, she wrote, sold to Turnbull and Associates, Utah, May 7th, 1851, $1,200. The forgery was flawless. After 9 years of keeping her husband's books, she knew every curve and slant of his handwriting. The transaction that took place in Utah that afternoon, May 7th, 1851, appeared utterly ordinary. Jacob was delivered to Mr. Turnbull by Pierce, along with a letter bearing Thomas Hartley's signature, forged perfectly by Catherine. The letter explained that circumstances had forced an unexpected sale, and that payment should be handled with urgency. Cash was acceptable. Mr. Turnbull, a sharp-eyed man with 15 years in the slave trade, had seen every form of deceit and desperation. He inspected Jacob the way one might examine livestock, checking his teeth, his hands, asking about his skills. Jacob answered numbly, still tried to understand what had happened, how he'd gone from delivering a message to being sold in the span of a single wagon ride. There's been some mistake, he insisted. Mr. Hartley, he wouldn't sell me. He needs me for carpentry work. Please, you have to send word to the plantation. Turnbull had heard it all before. Every man thought he was indispensable. Every man thought his owner valued him too much to sell. But in the end, they were all just property, and property changed hands. Boy, Turnbull said not unkindly, I've got a letter here with your master's signature and seal, and I've got authorization for payment. This is business. Legal and proper, Turnbull said firmly, and I'll thank you not to make a fuss about it. Jacob was taken to the back room of Turnbull's office, where 3 other enslaved people, 2 men and 1 woman, sat chained to the wall, waiting to be transported to Mobile. He was shackled beside them, the heavy chains biting into his wrists, the door locked behind him, and in the dim heat of that small room, with the distant hum of Utah's daily life drifting through the walls, Jacob began to understand. His life had just been irrevocably changed. Whatever he had believed about his connection to Thomas, whatever illusion of protection or safety he had clung to, was gone. It had never meant anything against the absolute power of ownership. But Jacob still didn't grasp the full depth of what had been done to him. That same afternoon, Catherine waited. She waited until Thomas returned from the fields, until he had washed and changed for dinner, until the family was seated at the table, the girls chatting cheerfully about their lessons. Then, as the first course was being served, she spoke in her calm, deliberate way. Thomas, I took care of some business for you today. You've been so busy with the planting, and I know you've been worried about our cash reserves. Thomas looked up from his soup, attentive but not yet alarmed. Catherine often handled such matters. I sold Jacob to Turnbull in town, she continued evenly. Got $1,200 for him, full value. The money's in your desk. I thought we could use it to make that payment to merit for the seed we bought on credit. The color drained from Thomas's face. His spoon clattered against the bowl. For a moment, he couldn't find words. You what? He finally managed to say. I sold Jacob, Catherine repeated, meeting her husband's eyes with unwavering composure. You've been saying we needed to liquidate some assets. He's skilled enough to fetch a top price, and there are other carpenters in the quarters who can handle his work. It seemed the practical choice. Thomas rose so violently that his chair crashed to the floor. You had no right. You can't just... I never authorized. I'm your wife, Catherine interrupted, still calm, her tone even, precise. I manage the household, including the accounts. You've given me signing authority on plantation business many times before. I use your seal. Everything was legal and proper. Where is he? Thomas demanded. I'll go to Turnbull right now. I'll cancel the sale. Turnbull planned to put him on the evening barge to Mobile, Catherine said coolly. It departed 2 hours ago. By now, Jacob is halfway down the Tombigbee River. But if you'd like to ride to Mobile and try to track him down, by all means do. I'm sure Mr. Turnbull can tell you which firm he sold him on to. There are only about 40 slave traders operating in Mobile. It shouldn't take you more than a few days to check them all. She paused, then added softly, almost gently, Of course, you'll need to explain why you're so desperate to get him back. I'm sure people will be very curious why one carpenter is so irreplaceable. Thomas stood trembling, rage, shame, and despair twisting inside him, but he could not speak, not in front of his daughters, not in front of the house servants who stood silently by the walls, waiting to clear the dishes. He knew, in that moment, that Catherine knew. He didn't know how much she knew, but it was enough to destroy him, enough to turn the system that gave him absolute power over Jacob into the very weapon that stripped that power away. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice strangled. "I'm not feeling well." He left the dining room. Catherine listened to his footsteps on the stairs, then the sharp slam of the study door. She turned back to her daughters, who sat wide-eyed and silent. "Your father is overtired from planting," she said pleasantly. "Now, tell me, what did you learn in your French lesson today?" But Catherine's revenge was not yet complete. Not quite, because while Jacob had indeed been sold to Turnbull that afternoon, he had not been placed on any barge to Mobile. That was a lie, crafted carefully to keep Thomas from chasing after him. Jacob was still in Utah, locked in the stifling back room of Turnbull's office. And later that evening, after the town had quieted and the lamps were lit, Turnbull received another visitor. Her name was Viola Garrison, though she hadn't used that surname in years. She ran an establishment in Mobile's theater district, a brothel that catered to a very specific and very discreet clientele. Most such houses in Mobile satisfied the appetites of wealthy white men seeking enslaved or free women of color. Viola's establishment, however, was different. Her clients were men, and the enslaved companions she offered were men as well. It was, of course, illegal, like all acts of sodomy in Alabama, but it was profitable. And as long as it was kept quiet, as long as the right officials were paid to look the other way, it was tolerated. Viola purchased enslaved men from various sources, sometimes from traders selling men who were damaged or unsuited for field work, sometimes from owners who suspected certain tendencies that made those men dangerous to keep, and sometimes from private arrangements like the one she had with Mr. Turnbull. He contacted her whenever he came across men who fit her particular requirements. The arrangement for Jacob had been made 3 days earlier, during a private meeting with a woman traveling under an assumed name. The woman had been very specific. She wanted one particular enslaved man purchased and placed in one particular situation. She had offered generous payment, not only the purchase price, but a significant fee on top of it. Viola had asked no questions. Women who made such arrangements usually had their reasons, and those reasons were none of her concern. On the evening of May 7th, Viola paid Turnbull $1,200 for Jacob, plus his fee for arranging the sale. Jacob was loaded into a closed wagon and transported to Mobile, a journey of roughly 60 miles that took most of a day and a night. He was given water, but no explanation. He remained chained the entire time. When the wagon finally stopped and he was led into a large townhouse in one of Mobile's finer neighborhoods, he could barely comprehend what he was seeing. It looked like a home, elegant, almost luxurious, but the windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the rooms were furnished in a way that felt both opulent and sordid. Other men were there, enslaved men, who looked at him with expressions of pity and weary recognition. One of them, a man named Samuel who had been there for 2 years, spoke to him that first night. He explained what the house was, what was expected of them, and what would happen if they resisted. The men who came there paid dearly for their pleasures, Samuel told him, and they showed no mercy to those who refused. Jacob listened, the horror sinking slowly through his exhaustion and disbelief. Catherine Hartley hadn't simply sold him. She hadn't merely separated him from Thomas. She had sent him to a place where what he had done in private with the man he had once shared a connection with, however tangled, complicated, and corrupted that connection had been, would now be forced upon him again and again with strangers. What had once, in the quiet moments of the study, carried some flicker of intimacy, however poisoned by the fundamental imbalance between them, was now reduced to something purely transactional, utterly degrading. It was a punishment that, in Catherine's mind, fit the crime perfectly. If Jacob and Thomas wished to indulge in such acts, then Jacob would now be condemned to do so endlessly, with anyone who could pay, stripped of all pretense of affection or choice. But Catherine's vengeance was not yet complete. One final act remained. Thomas Hartley spent the following week in a state of restrained desperation. He could not ride to Mobile to search for Jacob. To do so would mean explaining why one enslaved carpenter mattered so much. Nor could he confront his wife. Doing that would mean admitting what she had seen. He was trapped by his own secret, bound by the same shame that had silenced him all along. He tried to function as usual, overseeing the fields, attending to business, speaking to Catherine with a cold, distant politeness. But inside he was unraveling. Jacob's sudden absence tore through him, made worse by the realization that Catherine had outplayed him completely. She held all the power now. She knew his secret, and with one word, she could destroy him utterly. On May 14th, exactly 1 week after Jacob's sale, Catherine came to Thomas's study after dinner. She closed the door behind her and stood watching him. He sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey, his third that evening. "I've been thinking," Catherine began, "about our situation, about the future of this family." Thomas said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. "I will never speak of what I know," she continued. "I won't expose you. Our marriage will go on as it always has, at least in appearance. You will continue your duties as husband and father, and I'll continue mine as wife and mother. No one ever has to know that anything changed. Where did you send him?" Thomas asked quietly. "At least tell me that. Is he well? Is he safe?" "He's alive," Catherine said coolly. "That's all you need to know, and more than you deserve." She turned toward the door, then paused. "There's one more thing. I've decided we need an overseer with more experience, someone capable of handling the daily operations. I've arranged for Mr. Rutledge to be replaced. His successor arrives tomorrow." Thomas looked up, puzzled by this abrupt turn. "The new overseer's name is Pierce," Catherine said. "You might remember him. He was the one who drove the wagon that took Jacob to town. I've purchased his contract from the Danforth Plantation. He'll be living in the overseer's house, and I expect you to give him full authority over the plantation." The threat was unspoken but unmistakable. Pierce had helped remove Jacob. He knew something, even if not everything, and he was Catherine's man now, loyal to her, watching Thomas. It was another chain, another means of control. "You've thought of everything," Thomas said bitterly. "Yes," Catherine replied simply. "I have." She left him alone in his study, surrounded by his books, his maps, and his ledgers, the same room where he had committed the sin that had cost him everything. And for the first time in his adult life, Thomas Hartley wept. But Catherine had underestimated one thing: the human capacity for obsession. For Thomas, despite his grief and humiliation, was not a man who accepted defeat easily. His life had been built on control of land, of labor, and of his carefully maintained image. The idea that Catherine had won completely, that Jacob was gone forever, and nothing could be done, was intolerable. In the days that followed, Thomas began to investigate quietly. He wrote to contacts in Mobile under false pretenses, inquiring about the slave markets, about recent sales, about where a skilled carpenter from Greene County might have been sent. He spoke to traveling merchants passing through Utter. In a moment of desperation, he even considered hiring a slave catcher to track Jacob down, but quickly realized how impossible that would be to justify. What Thomas sought though he could never have said aloud, was not just Jacob. It was a restoration of his own power, his control. Catherine had humiliated him, made him see how his secret made him weak. Finding Jacob, undoing what Catherine had done, was his way to reclaim that power. By the end of May, Thomas had gathered enough information to learn that Jacob had been purchased by a woman named Viola Garrison, who ran some sort of boarding house in Mobile. He didn't yet know what kind of establishment it was, but he had the address. On the morning of June 2nd, 1851, Thomas told Catherine he had business in Mobile that would keep him away for several days. Catherine watched him leave with a quiet, cold satisfaction. She knew exactly where he was going. Of course she did. She had counted on it. Men like Thomas always believed they could fix things, reclaim control, undo the consequences of their own actions. And she knew that what awaited him in Mobile would be the final act of her carefully constructed revenge. Mobile in 1851 was a city of striking contrasts. The waterfront teemed with commerce. Cotton bales stacked high, ships from around the world docked side by side, merchants, sailors, and laborers moving in constant motion. Just a few blocks inland, the theater district offered another kind of trade, one conducted in shadows and whispers. Gambling houses, saloons, and brothels operated openly enough to be found, but discreetly enough to preserve a veneer of respectability. Viola Garrison's house at 47 Front Street was a 3-story brick building with black shutters and a brass nameplate that read simply, "The Garrison House." Nothing about it betrayed its true nature. It could easily have passed for a respectable boarding house or a merchant's home. That was entirely by design. Thomas Hartley arrived there on the evening of June 11th after a long, punishing ride that left him exhausted and covered in dust. He had taken a morning coach from Utter to Demopolis, then rented a horse for the rest of the journey, a deliberately roundabout route to avoid anyone who might recognize him or question his motives. The journey had given him far too much time to think, to imagine what he might find, to rehearse the conversations he knew, deep down, would never go as he hoped. When he finally arrived, he checked into a small hotel on Royal Street. Under an assumed name, John Thompson of Montgomery, paying in advance with coins instead of a letter of credit that might trace back to Greene County. The room was small and plain, with a narrow bed and a washstand, its single window looking out onto an alley where stray cats fought over scraps. Thomas washed the dust from his face and hands, changed his shirt, and spent nearly an hour sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to steady his nerves. The full weight of what he was doing had begun to sink in during the journey. He had abandoned his plantation at the height of the growing season, left Catherine without explanation, and traveled to a city where he knew almost no one, all to pursue a man he had no legal claim to anymore. If anyone in Greene County discovered where he had gone and why, the scandal would be catastrophic. But the alternative, accepting that Jacob was gone forever, that Catherine had won so completely, was unbearable. As twilight deepened into night, Thomas finally left the hotel and made his way toward Front Street. The city transformed after dark. Respectable citizens retreated indoors, and another population emerged. Sailors in search of amusement, merchants seeking pleasures they could not indulge in daylight, and men of every class drawn to the district's secret temptations. Thomas moved among them, feeling utterly out of place, a country planter adrift in an urban underworld he barely understood. He found the address easily enough. It was written on a small slip of paper that he had checked at least a dozen times during the trip. But as he stood across the street from the building, staring at its shuttered windows and unmarked black door, a wave of doubt washed over him. What exactly was he planning to do? March up and demand Jacob's return? On what grounds? With what authority? He was no longer Jacob's legal owner. Catherine had made sure of that. He was just a stranger driven by an obsession he could not explain to anyone. He was still frozen there, caught between impulse and hesitation, when the front door opened and a man stepped out, a well-dressed gentleman of perhaps 50, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. The man glanced up and down the street, his eyes sweeping both directions before descending the steps and walking briskly into the darkness. There was something about his manner, the way he checked to make sure no one was watching, the subtle adjustment of his collar as if to hide his face, that confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion. This was no ordinary boarding house. Thomas waited until the street was empty, except for a drunk slumped against a wall 2 buildings down. Then he crossed the street and climbed the steps. The door was solid oak, painted black, with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. He rapped twice. The sound echoed too loudly in the quiet street. A small viewing panel slid open, revealing a pair of sharp eyes that studied him. His clothes, his posture, his nervousness. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I'm looking for Mrs. Garrison. I have business with her regarding a recent acquisition." There was a long pause. Thomas felt those eyes measuring him, deciding whether he was a threat, a potential customer, or something else entirely. Then came the sound of locks turning, 3 of them, by his count, and the door opened just wide enough for him to step inside. He found himself in a dimly lit entrance hall illuminated by a single gas lamp turned low. The walls were covered in dark red wallpaper, and the polished wood floor was partly hidden by an oriental rug. The man who had opened the door, a large, muscular figure clearly serving as both doorman and guard, gestured for Thomas to wait, then disappeared through a door to the left. Standing alone, Thomas became acutely aware of the sounds drifting from deeper in the building. Faint, muffled music, a piano somewhere upstairs, interspersed with laughter, murmured voices, and the creak of floorboards. Beneath it all was a certain unmistakable energy, the charged atmosphere of a place where intimacy was traded for money. The doorman returned and motioned for Thomas to follow. They passed through the door on the left, down another hallway papered in gold silk and lined with paintings of peaceful country scenes, images grotesquely out of place in a house like this. Finally, they entered a richly furnished parlor, where a woman sat behind an ornate mahogany desk. Viola Garrison was perhaps 45, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair pulled back tightly and sharp features that suggested both intelligence and a hardness born from experience. She wore a dark green silk gown, elegant but restrained, with a simple cameo at her throat, the attire of a respectable widow, which was exactly how she presented herself to polite mobile society. Her eyes, when they met his, were cool and assessing, the eyes of someone who had seen every form of human weakness and knew precisely how to profit from it. "Mr. Thompson, is it?" she said in a cultured voice with the faintest trace of a Virginia accent. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "My doorman tells me you wish to discuss an acquisition. I'm not sure what you mean. I run a boarding house for gentlemen, nothing more." Thomas sat down, gripping the arms of the chair tightly. "We both know that's not true, Mrs. Garrison," he said evenly. "And we both know I wouldn't be here if I believed otherwise. You purchased a man named Jacob from a trader in Utter about 4 weeks ago. I want him back. I'm prepared to pay whatever price you name." Viola regarded him for a long, unreadable moment. Then she opened a drawer, withdrew a leather-bound ledger, and flipped through a few pages. "I've purchased many men from many traders, Mr. Thompson," she said calmly. "You'll have to be more specific." "He's 28 years old," Thomas said, hearing the desperation rising in his own voice and hating it. "A skilled carpenter, originally from the Hartley Plantation in Greene County. Tall, strong, literate. I have reason to believe he's here, in this house." "Ah," Viola said softly, her finger pausing on a page. "That one." She leaned back in her chair and closed the book with a quiet thud. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Thompson, or should I say Mr. Hartley?" Thomas froze. "Yes," she continued smoothly. "I thought as much. The man you're looking for is not for sale." "Everything is for sale," Thomas said sharply. "Name your price. I'll pay double what you paid, triple if necessary. I have access to considerable funds." "You misunderstand," Viola replied, her tone polite but firm. "When I say he's not for sale, I don't mean the offer isn't high enough. I mean that a specific arrangement was made when I acquired him. An arrangement that includes explicit terms prohibiting resale to anyone connected with his previous ownership. She paused deliberately, watching his face. The woman who facilitated that purchase, she went on, paid a substantial premium to ensure those terms would be honored. She was very clear about it. The color drained from Thomas's face. "Woman," he whispered. "What woman?" Viola smiled faintly, though the expression never reached her eyes. "I think you already know." Thomas didn't need to ask that question, and Viola knew it. "Mr. Hartley," she said evenly, "I think you already know the answer, and I think you know that coming here was pointless." She paused, studying him carefully. "But if you want to fully understand the situation you found yourself in, I can arrange for you to see him. Not to speak with him, only to see. Do you understand? My agreement forbids any contact. You can observe, nothing more." Some men find that helpful for closure. Every instinct in Thomas screamed at him to leave, to turn around, walk out of that house, ride back to Greene County, and try to salvage whatever was left of his life, to accept defeat and move on. But the same obsession that had driven him all the way to Mobile, the thing that had consumed him for an entire month, refused to let go. He had to see Jacob. He had to know this was real. He had to understand just how far Catherine's cruelty had gone. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Viola reached for a small silver bell on her desk and rang at once. The massive doorman appeared almost instantly, as if he had been waiting right outside. "Take Mr. Hartley to the viewing room," she instructed. "He may watch through the panel for 10 minutes. Make sure he understands the rules. No sound, no contact of any kind. If he breaks them, remove him immediately." Thomas followed the man back into the hallway, up a thickly carpeted staircase that swallowed every footstep, and down a long corridor lined with closed doors. Behind them came faint noises, muffled voices, slow movements, the rhythmic creak of bed frames. The doorman stopped near the end of the hall, unlocked the door, and motioned for Thomas to enter. The space was barely larger than the closet, perhaps 6 feet by 4, with nothing but a small wooden stool. One wall held a sliding panel, which revealed a pane of thick, slightly warped one-way glass, designed so that those on the other side could never see out. 10 minutes, the doorman said flatly. "Don't make a sound. Don't touch the glass. When I come back, you leave." "Understood." Thomas nodded, unable to form words. The man stepped out and locked the door behind him. The sound of the key turning was unmistakable. He was as much a prisoner here as those inside. Slowly, Thomas turned toward the window. Through the glass, he saw a room, luxurious, yet suffocating in its implications. It was about 15 feet square, designed to suggest sensuality, but only managing to evoke dread. Red wallpaper pattern with gold fleur-de-lis. A large four-poster bed draped in crimson covers and overstuffed with pillows. Heavy curtains sealed the windows. Gas lamps turned low cast everything in a dim, feverish red glow. A washstand sat in the corner, with a porcelain basin and pitcher. A wardrobe stood against one wall. Other items filled the space, objects Thomas tried not to identify. And the room was occupied. A white man, maybe 50, balding and soft-bodied from a life of comfort, sat on the edge of the bed, removing his shoes. Near the washstand, his back to the glass, stood Jacob. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He thought he'd prepared himself for this moment, thought he was ready to see Jacob again, but the reality struck like a physical blow. Jacob was thinner now, his shoulders sharper, his movements slower, deliberate. He wore only a pair of cotton trousers. His chest was bare. Even from behind, Thomas could see it, the loss of confidence, the weight of something crushing. The easy poise of a skilled craftsman was gone, replaced with guarded, broken stillness. The white man said something Thomas couldn't hear through the thick glass. Jacob turned, and in that instant, Thomas saw his face for the first time in a month. It was Jacob, yet it wasn't. His features were unchanged, but everything else had shifted. Where there had once been intelligence and quiet dignity, now there was only emptiness, a blankness perfected through repetition. His eyes, once bright and alive, were dull, dead, staring without seeing. The man on the bed gestured, giving an order. Jacob obeyed instantly, moving toward him with a mechanical precision that made Thomas's stomach twist. There was no hesitation. Jacob had done this before, many times. He knew the routine, the rules, the expectations, but there was no choice in it, no validation, no humanity, only the practiced, hollow motions of man conditioned to serve. What Thomas witnessed over the next 10 minutes would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jacob, performing the act with a detached efficiency that could only have come from repetition. The white man's hands, careless, possessive, moved over Jacob's body as if he were an object, a thing. Jacob's face remained unchanged, his mind clearly elsewhere, his presence reduced to mere flesh. It was not lovemaking. It wasn't even desire. It was labor, degrading, soul-breaking labor, the kind of work done only to survive. And Jacob endured it with the same quiet resignation that enslaved men once showed in the fields, their spirits crushed under the overseer's whip. It was survival, stripped of every trace of dignity. Thomas wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He needed to see it, needed to face what Catherine had done. Because whatever had existed between them, complicated, forbidden, poisoned by power and circumstance, had at least been human. What he saw now was that same intimacy, industrialized and sold to strangers. Catherine hadn't just taken Jacob from him. She had transformed their secret into punishment. She had turned Jacob into a product used by men night after night and ensured that Thomas would know it. That one day he would come here, stand exactly where he stood now, and see exactly what he was seeing. The lock behind him clicked. The doorman opened the door. "Time's up," he said, not unkindly, but without emotion. Thomas stumbled back on the glass, his legs trembling under him. The panel slid shut, cutting off his view of the bedroom and everyone inside. Thomas stood there, staring at the blank wood for a long moment before the door opened. The doorman motioned him out, leading him back down the corridor, past the muffled sounds, down the staircase, through the heavy air of that cursed house, and into Viola's parlor once more. She looked up when he entered, her calm, practiced expression suggesting she had seen this kind of reaction many times before. "Now you understand," she said softly, gesturing toward a chair. Thomas didn't move. He stood swaying slightly, his face pale and drawn. "The woman who arranged this," Viola continued, "wanted you to know. That's why she gave me your description. Told me you would come eventually. She wanted you to see exactly what she's done and to understand that there's no undoing it. How do I end this?" Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "There must be a way. How do I get him out?" "You don't," Viola said simply. She opened her ledger, turned to a marked page, and began to read. "The terms of the arrangement are quite clear, Mr. Hartley. If you or anyone connected to you attempts to purchase him, contacts the authorities, or causes any trouble, certain documents will be released to very interested parties. Documents explaining why you're so desperate to recover this particular man." She looked up briefly. "Your wife was meticulous." Thomas felt the room tilt around him. "Documentation," Viola said. "Letters, written in your hand, to Jacob, found in your study. Your wife keeps them safe, along with her own account of what she witnessed. If you interfere with the arrangement, these letters will be sent to the district attorney, to your pastor, to the newspaper, to anyone who might find them enlightening." Her tone didn't change. "I believe you understand what that would mean for you." Thomas understood. Perfectly. In Alabama, in 1851, the crime of sodomy carried a sentence of up to 10 years of hard labor, but the punishment would begin long before any trial. He would be denounced from every pulpit, cast out of every parlor, stripped of his reputation and livelihood. His daughters would be shunned, their futures destroyed. Every partnership, every friendship, every shred of respectability would vanish. Catherine hadn't only trapped Jacob, she had trapped him too. If Thomas tried to free Jacob, he would have to destroy himself first. And Catherine had known that all along. She had planned for it, down to the smallest detail. With the same cold precision she once used to balance the plantation's ledgers. "How long?" he asked, his voice hollow. Viola glanced at her ledger again. "Your wife paid for 20 years of service in advance. That brings us to 1871. After that," she hesitated, then continued, "if he survives, I'm instructed to sell him to Beaumont Sugar Works in Louisiana." Your wife was very clear about that destination. Thomas knew what that meant. The sugar plantations were death sentences. Men didn't live long there, cutting cane in the swamps, feeding the grinders, choking in the scalding air of the refineries. Few lasted more than a handful of years. It was where owners sent those they wanted punished or erased. Catherine had arranged for Jacob's suffering to continue long after his time here ended. "There's one more thing you should know," Viola said quietly. There was something new in her voice, a trace of sympathy, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of landing the final blow. "Your wife visits Mobile twice a year. She stays at the Waverly Hotel, tend to business, and comes here. She never sees him, but I provide her with reports. How he's doing, how many clients he's served, whether he's remained healthy and compliant. She seems to take considerable satisfaction in hearing it." The image hit Thomas like a blow. Catherine, sitting in the same parlor, listening to updates on Jacob's degradation, perhaps even taking notes in her precise handwriting. This wasn't vengeance left to time. This was cruelty maintained, monitored, perfected. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because your wife paid me to," Viola said matter-of-factly. "Part of our contract was that if you ever came looking, I was to tell you everything. She wanted you to know not just what she had done, but that she continues to do it, that she thinks of it often, and that your pain gives her pleasure. I'm simply honoring our agreement." Thomas turned toward the door. His legs moved, but his mind felt detached, struggling to comprehend the weight of what he'd heard. Viola didn't stop him. The doorman appeared and escorted him silently through the red paper hallway, through the grand entryway, and finally to the front door. Just before he stepped out into the humid night, Thomas turned. "Is there any kindness in this place?" he asked quietly. "Any mercy at all?" The doorman's face didn't change. "There's efficiency, sir. There's order. Kindness and mercy aren't part of what's purchased here." The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Thomas Hartley walked into the mobile night with no clear direction. His thoughts wouldn't settle. His mind kept circling the images seared into his memory. Somehow, he ended up at the waterfront, standing on the dock as the black water lapped against the pilings. Lanterns swayed on distant ships. Somewhere out in the darkness, a man sang a work song in a language Thomas didn't know. The world went on, indifferent to his pain. He stood there for nearly an hour, and slowly a terrible clarity took hold. He could not save Jacob. He could not undo what Catherine had done. He could not even speak of it, not to a lawyer, a friend, or minister. To explain would be to confess, and confession meant ruin. Catherine's revenge was perfect, a trap with no exit. By the time he returned to his hotel, the first light of dawn had touched the horizon. He collapsed fully clothed onto the bed and lay staring at the ceiling as sunlight filled the room. He didn't sleep. He didn't weep. He just lay there hollow, replaying every image in his mind, realizing that this was his life now, this horror, and would remain so for the next 20 years, until Jacob was finally sent to Louisiana to die among the cane fields. The journey back to Greene County took 2 days. He traveled in silence, changing coaches in Demopolis, hiring a horse for the final leg. On the afternoon of June 5th, covered in dust and exhaustion, Thomas arrived at Hartley Plantation. He found Catherine in the morning room, embroidering, her expression calm and composed, as though nothing had changed at all. She looked up as he entered, set her needlework aside, and met his eyes. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked at last. "Were you looking for something?" Catherine finally asked, her voice perfectly calm and polite. "You know I was," Thomas replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Good," Catherine said simply. "Then we understand each other." She picked up her embroidery again, threading her needle with green silk. "Dinner is at 6, as always. Reverend Carlyle and his wife will be joining us. I trust you'll make yourself presentable." Thomas stood there for a moment longer, wanted to rage at her, to demand answers, to ask how she could be so cruel, but he already knew. She had been humiliated, betrayed, reduced to nothing in her own eyes. And now she had the power, through law, through custom, through the very system they both live within, to strike back, to destroy both men who had wronged her, while preserving her own reputation. He turned and went upstairs to his room. They no longer shared a bedroom, a change that had happened immediately after Jacob's sale. Something Thomas had been too defeated to question. He washed, changed his clothes, and at 6 o'clock sharp, presented himself in the dining room, wearing his public mask, that of a successful planter and respected community leader. Reverend Carlyle and his wife arrived promptly. Dinner was served by the house staff, who moved through their duties with practiced precision. The conversation flowed through the usual topics: the state of the cotton crop, politics in Montgomery, the new railroad line being planned, missionary work among the Cherokee. Thomas spoke when expected, laughed at the Reverend's anecdotes, agreed with his theological musings. Catherine was a perfect hostess, attentive, graceful, guiding the conversation with quiet mastery. To any observer, the Hartleys appeared exactly as they seemed: a prosperous, respectable family, pillars of their community, living the life their position entitled them to live. No one could have guessed the devastation beneath that calm surface, the terrible secret that bound husband and wife together in mutual hatred. This became the pattern of their lives. They maintained appearances with rigid discipline. Thomas managed the plantation, oversaw business, and fulfilled his social duties. Catherine ran the household, directed the servants, and sat on the boards of charitable societies. They spoke with distant politeness. They never again referred to what had happened. But Thomas aged quickly. His hair turned from iron gray to white, and deep lines of worry and sorrow carved into his face, far deeper than his comfortable life could explain. He began avoiding social gatherings whenever he could find an excuse. He drank more, often sitting alone in his study late into the night, a bottle of whiskey beside him, staring at the empty chair where Jacob used to sit when he came in the evenings, pretending to discuss carpentry work. The study became both Thomas's refuge and his prison. He kept it locked when not in use, allowed no one to clean it. He tended it himself, dusting the books, polishing the furniture, keeping everything exactly as it had been in the spring of 1851. It was as though he were preserving a shrine to something lost, though he could never have explained it to anyone. Catherine, in contrast, seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. She took over more of the plantation's management, making decisions that once would have been Thomas's alone. Her charitable work expanded, and she became known throughout Greene County as a woman of remarkable competence and moral standing. When the other planters' wives gathered for sewing circles or quilting bees, Catherine was always at the center, their respect and attention naturally drawn to her. Sometimes they whispered about it, how Catherine Hartley had become the real power behind the Hartley Plantation, how Thomas deferred to her in matters large and small, how their marriage seemed curiously hollow despite its outward perfection. But no one knew the truth, and Catherine never told them. Twice a year, she traveled to Mobile on shopping trips, always staying at the Waverly Hotel, always returning with fabrics, furniture, and other household goods. What she did during those trips, the visits to 47, Front Street, the private meetings with Viola Garrison, the satisfaction she took from hearing that her revenge endured, remained her own secret. Thomas knew, but said nothing. What could he possibly say? The Hartley daughters grew up amid this atmosphere of polite silence and tightly held composure. Margaret, the eldest, married in 1859 at 16 to the son of a merchant from Tuscaloosa. It was considered an excellent match, one that strengthened the family's place in Alabama society. Eleanor followed in 1862, marrying a young lawyer from Mobile. But the world was changing. The Civil War had begun the previous year, tearing apart the South and destroying the entire system upon which families like the Hartleys had built their fortunes. Federal troops never reached Greene County directly, but the economic ruin was total. The plantation limped along until 1864, producing for a Confederate economy that was already collapsing. When Union victory came in 1865, everything changed. The enslaved people on Hartley Plantation were freed by the 13th Amendment. Some left immediately, heading north or west in search of family members sold away years before. Others stayed, with nowhere else to go, working now as paid laborers, though the wages were meager and often paid in scrip instead of coin. The cotton economy that had sustained the Black Belt was shattered. It would take decades to rebuild, and would never again reach its antebellum glory. Thomas Hartley did not live to witness that transformation. He died in 1863 at the age of 55, officially from heart failure. The attending doctor noted that Mr. Hartley seemed simply to have lost the will to live, wasting away over several months without any clear illness. Those who attended his funeral, a smaller gathering than one might have expected for a man of his stature, given the wartime hardships, remarked that his widow appeared composed rather than grief-stricken. She wore her mourning black with dignity, but not sorrow. Catherine Hartley lived until 1892, dying at the age of 70, nearly 30 years after her husband. She navigated the Reconstruction era with the same cold precision that had guided her through the plantation's heyday. She converted the Hartley lands to tenant farming, invested in the Birmingham steel industry, and maintained her family's position through adaptability rather than nostalgia. She never remarried. She never, so far as anyone knew, showed interest in another man. Her life was devoted to her daughters, her grandchildren, and to preserving the Hartley name and fortune. When Catherine died in the winter of 1892, more than 200 people attended her funeral. She was remembered as a pillar of her community, a woman of exceptional strength and capability who had guided her family through the war and its aftermath. The eulogies praised her business sense, her charitable works, her devotion to family. Reverend Carlyle, now an old man but still serving his congregation, spoke of her as a model Christian woman, one whose life had been defined by dignity and service. No one mentioned the spring of 1851. No one spoke the name Jacob, erased from the family's history as completely as he had been erased from the plantation. No one knew what Catherine had done, or why. In Mobile, Jacob had survived 6 years in the garrison house. 6 long years of mechanical servitude to men whose names he never learned, whose faces blurred together in his memory. He endured by using the same method enslaved people had relied on for generations, by separating his mind from his body, going somewhere else in spirit while his flesh obeyed what was required. He found fragments of humanity in brief conversations with others trapped in that house, holding fast to a core within himself that no one could reach, no matter what they did to him. In 1857, as Viola Garrison had promised Thomas, Jacob was sold to Beaumont Sugar Works outside New Orleans. The sale was handled through an agent. Viola never dealt directly with the sugar plantations, which she found distasteful even by her own standards. Jacob made a journey downriver in chains with 20 other enslaved men, all bound for work known to be a slow death sentence. The sugar plantation was exactly as the story said it was. The labor was brutal. 16-hour days during harvest, standing knee-deep in water, cutting cane, feeding into iron rollers that could crush a man's arm in an instant, working the boiling houses where heat was unbearable and the caustic fumes burned eyes and lungs. Men died constantly, from exhaustion, from accidents, from disease that thrived in the swampy air. The owners calculated that it was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to sustain them for the long term. Jacob lasted 3 years at Beaumont. 3 years of torment that made his time in the garrison house seem almost merciful by comparison. There at least he had been kept alive. Viola Garrison had a financial motive to maintain her assets. At Beaumont, he was nothing but fuel, another cog in the machinery of sugar production, to be used up and discarded. In November of 1860, Jacob died. The plantation records listed fever as a cause, a vague term that could have meant any of a dozen diseases common in the Louisiana lowlands. He was 37 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the plantation cemetery, one of hundreds who had died at Beaumont over the decades. No one mourned him. No one marked his passing. He simply vanished. Another life erased by the institution of slavery. There is no record of whether Thomas Hartley ever learned of Jacob's death. By 1860, Thomas himself was already fading, consumed by guilt, grief, and the unbearable knowledge he could share with no one. Perhaps he never knew Jacob was gone. Perhaps he spent his final years imagining him still alive and suffering in Louisiana, still enduring the punishment Catherine had decreed. Maybe that ignorance was a mercy, or maybe it was simply another layer of tragedy. The truth of what had happened at Hartley Plantation in the spring of 1851 remained buried for more than 70 years. It surfaced only by a peculiar accident of history, the kind of random twist that sometimes uncovers secrets meant to stay hidden forever. In 1924, the old Hartley mansion in Greene County was being demolished. The property had been sold after Catherine's death, passed through several owners, and finally purchased by a developer planning to subdivide the land. The house, decaying and neglected, was considered not worth saving, and workers began dismantling it room by room. In what had once been Thomas Hartley's study, a worker removing the wainscoting discovered a sealed cavity inside the wall. Hidden within was a black-painted metal box, about a foot long and 8 inches wide. The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. The worker pried it open with a crowbar. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written in the same elegant feminine handwriting, each addressed to "My dear sister Caroline." They were neatly arranged in order, dated from May 1851 to August 1854. They told, in meticulous detail, the entire story of Catherine Hartley's revenge. The letters had been written to Catherine's sister in Charleston, but never sent. Perhaps she had meant to post them and change her mind, or perhaps she had written them only to gather her thoughts, to record what she had done, to create a private testament to her triumph, even if no one else would ever know of it. Whatever her purpose, she hid them within the wall, preserved there by accident for 7 decades. The worker who found them couldn't read very well himself, but he recognized that they were old, possibly valuable. He carried them to the Greene County Historical Society, hoping they might be worth a few dollars. The society secretary, Mrs. Dolores Fletcher, a retired teacher who had dedicated her later years to preserving local history, read the letters with growing shock and fascination. She immediately realized their historical importance and the scandal they represented. She brought them before the society's board, elderly men who had known the Hartley family or their descendants. After heated discussion, they concluded the letters were too controversial to be made public, at least for the time being. They sealed them in the society's archives, marked with a note stating that they could not be opened without board approval. But Mrs. Fletcher, fearing for their safety if left in Greene County, secretly made a copy. She sent it to her sister-in-law in Mobile, a librarian at the Mobile Historical Society. Recognizing their significance, the sister-in-law accepted the copy into the Mobile collection in 1925, where it remained sealed but preserved and cataloged. Over the decades, a handful of historians researching slavery in antebellum Southern society came across references to the Hartley letters. Some applied for access, but were denied. The Mobile Historical Society insisted the contents were too sensitive, too scandalous, that living descendants could still be harmed by their release. The The letters gained a kind of mythic reputation among scholars, a whispered legend, a secret everyone knew existed, but few had ever seen. It was not until 1983, it took 130 years after the events of the letters to finally be unsealed and made available to researchers. By then, every living person who had ever known anyone connected to the story was long gone. The Historical Society decided that enough time had passed, that the historical value of the letters outweighed any concerns about scandal or family shame. What those letters revealed was Catherine's mind in startling clarity. They showed her intelligence, her meticulous attention to detail, and her absolute conviction that everything she had done was justified. She described discovering Thomas and Jacob in the study. She explained her careful planning, the forged sale documents, her arrangement with Viola Garrison. She wrote about her trips to Mobile, the report she received, and the grim satisfaction she took in knowing both men were suffering exactly as she had intended them to. But the letters revealed something deeper too, a bitterness and sense of violation that went far beyond simple betrayal. Catherine wrote about the limits placed on her as a woman, the ways in which she had been forced to accept powerlessness in nearly every part of her life. She described her marriage as a prison, her daughters as both a joy and a burden, and her entire existence as one long performance meant to please a society that valued her only for her ability to keep up appearances. In one letter dated July 1851, she wrote, "Men tell us we are the weaker sex, that we must submit to their authority in all things. They call it God's will, nature's design, but they do not understand that weakness can be a weapon and that submission can conceal control." Thomas thought he was a master of Hartley Plantation, but I have shown him the truth. I am the one with power now. I decide fates. And I've used the very system meant to keep me in chains to destroy the men who wrong me. The letters offered no apology, no trace of regret. If anything, Catherine seemed proud of what she had accomplished. She had found the vulnerabilities of both men, Thomas's secret and Jacob's legal status as property, and she had exploited them with surgical precision. She had turned the tools of slavery itself against them, using the absolute power of ownership to exact a revenge that was perfectly legal, entirely unquestionable, and utterly devastating. Modern historians still debate the meaning of these letters. Some see them as proof that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, turning even victims into perpetrators of cruelty. Catherine, they argue, had been trapped by the gender constraints of her world. Powerless in most ways, she used the only form of power available to her, control over enslaved lives, to strike back at her husband. That made her both victim and victimizer, oppressed and oppressor at once. Others, however, see something darker in her writings. They see not just a woman shaped by her society, but someone who discovered she enjoyed having absolute power, someone who found pleasure in cruelty, the care with which she planned her revenge, the detail of its execution, the satisfaction she took in Thomas's suffering. All of it suggests a woman not merely reacting betrayal, but embracing the role of tormentor. And then there's Jacob, the one whose voice is completely missing from the record. Catherine mentions him only as a tool of Thomas's sin and a target of her vengeance. There are no letters from him, no diary, no testimony. His thoughts, his emotions, his inner life, all of it lost to history, erased by a system that treated him as property, not a person. We know only the rough outline of his story. Born into slavery, skilled at his trade, exploited by Thomas Hartley in ways both illegal and deeply personal, sold by Catherine into misery designed to destroy him, and dead before his 40th birthday. Whether he ever loved Thomas, whether there was any real feeling between them, or whether it was just another form of coercion, whether he hated Catherine or somehow understood her rage even as it doomed him, none of these questions have answers. What remains is a story of three people trapped in a system that warped every human relationship it touched. Thomas, whose desire for Jacob led him to abuse his power even as he risked everything to be with him. Catherine, whose fury at her own powerlessness found release in the destruction of two others. And Jacob, who had no power at all, swept up in forces far beyond his control, suffering and dying as a pawn in someone else's revenge. The Hartley Plantation story stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how slavery allowed for acts of shocking cruelty disguised as ordinary business. Catherine Hartley destroyed two men, using nothing but legal transactions and socially acceptable behavior. She did it so completely, so carefully, that for more than 70 years, no one even knew she'd done it. The papers she left behind reveal not only what happened, but the cold precision with which it was planned, and the satisfaction she took in seeing it through. What do you think about this story from 1851? Could Catherine's revenge ever be justified by the standards of her time? Or was it simply cruelty answering cruelty in an endless cycle? And what about Jacob? Should we see him as a victim of both Thomas and Catherine? Or is the truth far more complicated? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us if you've heard of other moments in history where the system of slavery enabled this kind of personal revenge. If you want more stories from America's hidden past, stories of power, shame, and the terrible things people do when the law gives them absolute control over others, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these dark corners of history that textbooks never teach. We'll see you in the next one as we continue exploring the secrets that shaped America.